Hi, and we are live. Welcome everybody to another edition of our Kobo Writing Life live Q&A. We're doing a Kobo focused edition this month with my lovely colleague, Wendy Reid. So welcome. Thanks for coming, Wendy.
Thanks for having me.
I think we're having a little connection issue with Facebook, but I assume by Laura's very serious face that you were fixing it.
I am looking into it, so hopefully we can resolve it soon.
So if you're checking this out on YouTube, let us know where you're coming in from. Hi, Susan. Thanks for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about all things accessibility with Wendy, who is Kobo's Accessibility and Publishing Standards Lead. So you're working responsible for Kobo's accessibility and standards work, where you mainly focus on digital accessibility and technical standards for eBooks and audiobooks. And you've worked at Kobo for quite a while now. You just celebrated a milestone.
Yes, it's been 10 years somehow.
I know, it's wild. Like, how has this happened?
Time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
Yeah, totally. So if you have any questions, let us know in the chat and we'll sort of pick them up as we go along. And we also have some questions for Wendy that we can go through. So yeah, feel free to drop them in at any time. Susan's coming in to us from Illinois. Samantha is coming in from New York. So thanks for joining. So let's get started because we only have an hour, which seems like a long time, but always flies by. So Wendy, when we say accessibility, like what do we mean about that? Like when we say accessibility, it's sort of an all-encompassing phrase, but what do we actually mean?
Yeah, and it gets used in a lot of different contexts. So I understand why people might get confused seeing the term, but when I'm talking about accessibility, and when we're thinking about it, or at least when I'm thinking about it, it's making content, platforms, software, everything usable and available to people with disabilities, very specifically. There's a lot of knock-on effects to accessibility, but the main focus is on the needs and the requirements of people with disabilities of all kinds. And it can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different platforms or types of content.
Sorry,
I am muted. And how did you get into this sort of work within the ebook audiobook space?
Good question. So as you mentioned earlier, I do standards work. Specifically, I do standards work with an organization called the World Wide Web Consortium, which is an organization that does technical standards for the web, as the name suggests. But amongst their standards that I work on is I mostly focus on things like EPUB and digital publishing. And when I was doing that work and just getting into it, I got a lot of contact and a lot of, insight from members of the disability community who were in the group to help us make the formats even more accessible, because they are so essential to accessible reading and accessible access for people with disabilities. And learning from them, I had kind of taken accessibility for granted. I figured with the kind of proliferation of tech that a lot of the problems have been solved. Like everyone had an iPhone, everyone, has computer access. This must have been figured out by now, right? And what I learned from them was that no, it absolutely had not. There were still massive barriers in, access to tech, access to information, access to content. And, I could do something about it in my little corner of EPUB land and within Kobo. And I was like, it kind of just ignited something in me. I really don't know what, but I was like, we can do something about this. And it's a really fascinating area of tech to work in. And you get to work with really, really wonderful people. So yeah, I just absolutely fell in love.
It must feel sort of almost groundbreaking as well, because you are building the standards for a lot of this stuff. I remember going to like Tech Forum, which is like tech publishing-y conference in Toronto, and they had in like the workshops one year, it was about accessibility. And like you were saying, I think people can assume that technology is so wonderful that this is all looked after. But one of the tasks was to like turn on your screen reader on the phone or turn on the you're going to tell me the right term now, but like the speaking part of your phone and like be able to navigate through it. And I couldn't believe how difficult it was on an iPhone, and then how to like figure out the pieces. So yeah, even that little exercise really opened my eyes to kind of the struggle that people have when they're trying to use some of the features that do exist.
Oh yeah. And I mean, a lot of it is, it's learning, right? There's always going to be a learning curve to any new piece of tech. And so if you, highly recommend, you can look, I think there's videos on YouTube or on other platforms of like people who are really comfortable assistive technology users using their tech. Because when they're really good at it and when they're really practiced, it is magical. Like a lot of it is learning curve, but it's kind of like learning curve plus the fact that most apps, most websites, most tools are not accessible. But at the same time, people with disabilities are out there using these tools to do everyday tasks. So they've figured out workarounds, they've figured out, shortcuts or tricks to get things to work for them. And there's still cases where like something simply does not work. But for the most part, like they've conquered the learning curve and they're using this technology to do it looks amazing, but it's the same thing that we are doing on our phones or on our laptops.
Recently we had like an internal conference called KoboCon, and we kind of in your session got to look at what that screen reader experience is like for everyone. And yeah, learning curve is the right word for someone who doesn't use it like every day, but it is really insightful to see how all of that back end works. And I think it's a good experience for anyone to kind of play around with their phone and see what options are out there for someone who needs them.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing that people don't realize about accessibility options, like if you have an iPhone or if you have Android, if you go to your main settings menu, there will probably be I know an iPhone for sure, there's a menu called accessibility. I believe there is an Android as well. Feel free to go in and like turn on some of those features and try them out, because some of them are, there is a high learning curve. VoiceOver is the best example of that on iPhone. And on Android, it's called TalkBack. But there's other features out there like there's this thing called spoken content on iOS that I actually keep on my home screen at all times because it'll read the page to me if I just hit play. And it's so easy to use, and it's so handy, especially if I'm like reading an article or like you're on the streetcar or something and you just want to get through this like New York Times article that you're reading. You can just turn on spoken content, it'll read it to you, and you don't have to sit there staring at your phone. You can just keep your headphones in. And a lot of people have actually turned on some of these accessibility features day to day because they're really handy just for making your phone easier to use or making your laptop easier to use.
That's really awesome. I remember when I turned on the talkback feature, was very surprised that everyone else had a kind of North American sounding phone and mine was a British man, which was my default setting for some reason that I was unaware of. So that was sort of fun also to play around with what suits you as you're listening.
Oh yeah, and you can adjust speed, you can adjust the voice, you can, it's pretty adjustable, yeah.
So what about your work at Kobo specifically? So what are you doing, kind of like what does your day-to-day look like when you're trying to make digital reading more accessible?
Day to day, a lot of meetings, which I think is like the universal work experience, but a lot of meetings. I spend a lot of time doing research, trying to find the best ways to do things. I work a lot with all of our teams because we're trying, accessibility, especially at a tech company with multiple platforms, is a lot of bouncing around like, oh, there's a problem on the website. Oh, let's fix this thing on iOS. Oh, let's do this on Android. Oh, let's do this for the e-readers. And all of those problems have different nuances and facets to them. So I spend a lot of time researching, a lot of time testing, and a lot of time working with, I am on our on our UX team. I am the accessibility team. I'm on our UX team, and I spend a lot of time actually with our designers, particularly to try and catch accessibility issues early, so that we can design and build components and like things on our sites and our apps to make them more accessible from just like by default. so that we don't have to do a ton of work later with code or in testing to make them work for accessibility. But it is a lot of like day-to-day is going to different teams, sitting down with them, testing things, demoing stuff, giving advice, and then often answering questions and going and doing research because people come up with some really good questions. And then if I'm not doing team stuff, if I'm not doing that kind of research side, a lot of my week is dedicated to standards work. So the publishing side of things is actually a bit quiet right now. We're doing a little bit of work with fixed layout accessibility for fixed layout books. So I've actually shifted some of my focus to actually working on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are WCAG. You might have seen WCAG floating around if you've looked into any of this at all, because they're working on the next version of that specification. And I wanted to get involved because they want to expand the scope of it, and books and things are included. So I wanted to make sure that we were represented and we could make improvements.
You're kind of like Kobo's internal advocate for accessibility. So that's great that we're making all those changes. What would you say if an author asked you like why accessibility is important for them to consider with their books?
That is a really good question. And I would be so happy if authors asked that question. The most simple way to respond to that is basically, this always sounds vaguely threatening, but I promise it's not. Everyone is going to experience disability at some point in their lives. If not currently, it is going to happen to you. And I don't mean this in a mean way. This is, things happen to us as we age. Things happen to us, accidents happen, illness happens. Sometimes these things are temporary. Sometimes these things are permanent and life-changing. But we are all going to experience disability if we are not already. So the way I would describe working on accessibility is that you are planning for your future self, you are future-proofing your work, your content, and you're being inclusive of your audience. I think if you would ask most authors, they want their audience to be as big as possible. You want as many people as possible to read your books and enjoy your stories. The best way to do that is to make sure that your content is accessible, because you never know who's going to come to your content and want to enjoy it. And nothing, I think, something that pretty universally, in speaking with people with print disabilities, disabilities that impact their ability to read, especially print books and not digital, is the frustration that comes with maybe being recommended a book or coming across a title that looks absolutely amazing to you, opening it and being unable to read it. And being unable to read it only because the book was not designed for their needs. When the reality is, especially on the ebook side, it's really easy to make books accessible. It just takes a little bit of extra effort and a little bit of intentionality. So, just imagine, I think most authors would agree, we don't want to turn people away from our content. You don't want to tell someone, sorry, you can't read my book. So this is one way to do that and to make your audience as big as possible.
That's generally what we tell authors that are publishing on multiple platforms and being wide, is that you always want your books in front of as many readers as possible, however they want to read. And this is just another layer of that inclusion. So I love that you said that. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. I'll also add accessibility, when you make content, when you think about accessibility and you're thinking about the needs of users with disabilities, you're often improving the experience for everybody. You're doing things that, most people maybe take for granted, but actually appreciate. I think one of my favorite examples, just in common use today, is the number of people that love to use captions. That's watching TikTok, watching YouTube, watching Netflix. A lot of people have discovered that captions are a huge boon to their ability to enjoy content. Captions were designed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. They're an accessibility feature, but they've made things way better for everybody.
I love subtitles, so I love that example. Do you hear any common complaints from readers about accessibility that authors should be aware of?
That's a good one. I would say the biggest ones that I've heard are images not being described. Especially, I think there's a lot of frustration around images when it comes to like not knowing if that image is important or not, because sometimes an image is just decorative, it's not necessary, but without that being said or told to you, how do you know? It could be really important. It could be essential to the story. And to just, so like when you're using something like a screen reader and an image appears, you are told that the image is there, but if it's not described, it'll just stop at telling you that an image is there. And it can be really frustrating because you're like, well, is it important? Do I need to see, is it a graph or something? Like it's really frustrating for the user to like see this, come across this thing and not be able to enjoy it. So that's like probably one of the top complaints is like, if you are using images in your content, describe them, please. The other big kind of common theme is around navigation and knowing where you are in a book. And that one I say is like, it's a really simple one because it's like, well, have a really good table of contents that is detailed, name your chapters, make sure that, you know, if you have subsections or things in your book that you are like marking them up with headings. So it's like, here's the top level heading, a lower level heading, a lower, even lower level heading. Because that structure, especially for someone who may not be able to view the page, is essential to understanding like how this book flows or what is being communicated to me. There's a lot of it is just understanding the context of the page or the content. And you can do that with very simple markup.
Nice. Some comments here, enjoying captions as well for kind of just general usage, and also pointing out that we actually don't have them on this video. But Terrence is saying it's on the Facebook feed, and I know that it does get added to YouTube maybe post the fact, but we will work to make sure that that's included.
Yeah,
in the future.
it's not something that like StreamYard offers because you can turn it on through Facebook and through YouTube, the platform itself. But yeah, I think Terrence is going to link to how to do that for each platform. So thank you for pointing that out, guys.
I know, how terrible of us on this accessibility chat to not be inclusive.
Yeah.
But thanks, Wendy. Those are really great tips for like the author point of view. I know sometimes like a lot of our authors are using different platforms to like create their EPUB file themselves. So they might not even be like opening the file or even maybe kind of looking at it. But so I'm kind of curious if somebody's not familiar with creating it, like what questions could they ask how it's being created to ensure that it's accessible? Like how would an author know that their file is kind of as accessible as it could be?
Yeah. So one actually very easy way to, at least on your side, if you're not creating the EPUB yourself, if you're working in something like Word to write the manuscript, you can actually set it up really well in Word and mark things up in Word. And Word, actually all of the Office Suite products have accessibility checkers built into them. So you can use Word to set up your file really, really well. So that can include making sure that headings are headings, and you can like make sure that they're marked up that way. Describe your images, all of that stuff in Word. Use the word checker to check that you've done it well, and if there's any hazards or anything, like it'll. Sometimes it can be a bit aggressive, but it will, you know, tell you when things are. It'll do its best to tell you when things are incorrect or need improvement. And then the question to ask the platforms that you're distributing to is, you know, well, if I mark up my Word document really well and properly, are you using that information to make my EPUB? Like if I say that this is a heading 1 in my Word document, are you making sure that that's a heading 1 in the rendered like EPUB file? So that's a good question to ask. You can also check, like, I do know that some tools often have like creation advice on their platforms. Like, so checking into that and seeing if there's any accessibility things that they include in their documentation on their tools is a good thing to ask. If you don't see anything, ask them about it. Because I think one unfortunate thing is that many tools out there don't consider accessibility at all. And it's often because it's low priority. I put that in scare quotes because it's not low priority. It's incredibly important. 1 in 5 people worldwide has a disability of some kind. But a lot of companies have put this to the side, said we don't have disabled users, or disabled users don't use our platform. And to hear users of the platform going to them and saying like, hey, I need this feature, or I don't see any documentation about this, can kind of raise the alarm, or raise attention to be like, oh, maybe this is important. So don't be afraid to like ask questions of your platforms that you're using. But yeah, like if you set up your Word documents really well, they can often translate. There's actually a tool also out there, I will include a link to it, called Word to EPUB, that actually outputs really good EPUB files, and you can just do it on your computer. I've used it. I actually really like it because it's super easy to use. But yeah, ask those questions of your platforms. Check the documentation if they've got docs on their site or on the tool itself, to see like if there's special things that only that tool does or asks. And yeah, ask questions if there's no information available.
Hey, you're just reminding me that you're a writer yourself as well, so you see both sides of it. Because I believe, wasn't there one NaNoWriMo that you did the entire thing on your phone?
Yes, that was like I think my first NaNoWriMo.
Nice. So I wanted to kind of that's awesome to know about the Word tools that they can be used. So it doesn't mean that you have to have some sort of fancy tool to output an accessible file. It can be whatever you're using. But when you're saying about like alt text for images, for instance, like how detailed a description does it need to be? Is briefer better? Like what are the main sort of points of an image that you should be capturing?
So alt text is an art. Like there's no one right way to do alt text. If there was, that would be great. The usual advice is generally keep it succinct, keep it short as possible, especially when you're attaching it directly to the image. Different platforms have different requirements around this, so it can kind of vary. But generally, what you're trying to put in the alt text is whatever message or information you're trying to convey by using that image. So, what's pretty common on platforms nowadays, like Facebook and things like that, is that they use AI to say, oh, we think this image is a cat. And that you could say for alt text, like say you have a picture of a cat in your book. You could say this is a cat. But is that the message that you're trying to convey when you're including a cat in your book? So, because it could be, say, on your author bio, and you include a picture of your cat. You may want the alt text to say, this is the author's cat, Phoebe. It might be a story about a cat, and you may want to describe the cat. So like, this is a cat that is orange and with stripes. This is a large cat. This is a small cat. You really want to, like, in the alternative text, like convey whatever information is trying to be conveyed with that image. And so that means it is contextual, and it really depends on what is going on around the image. Now, for things like, say, a graph or some sort of like visualization, your alt text could possibly get kind of long. And there's ways to actually provide extended descriptions. I can say for sure in HTML, but and there are some tools out there that will let you, and like on, say, like social media, a lot of the Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have really long character counts for alternative text, so you can actually get pretty creative. But I would say like you want to describe like the contents of the graph really accurately, like what are the X and Y axes, what is the information you might want to give the values. Like it really depends on what information that you are trying to convey to the person.
I'm imagining like a sci-fi map or something, or like,
yeah,
like really describing your world.
Yeah, for sure. Like they can be really short, but they can also be really long, and you'll have to figure out for yourself, like what's the most appropriate way to communicate this.
And you spoke a little bit about the navigation within the file. And this is something that I always sort of mention to authors because Kobo readers really love box sets, and that can be an easy way to have like another edition, like another just book in your catalog of like this bundle of titles. But I think it's super important to have great navigation in a larger file like that. So what are sort of like basic navigations, like the header and stuff that you're talking about? And then what are other considerations for like even larger files?
I would say for even larger files, so like, yeah, like box set, I think is like a fantastic example of when structure can get really convoluted and really intense. So like, yeah, heading levels, absolutely. Like, use heading levels, because otherwise you don't want a flat navigation, because I've seen box sets that have flat navigation and it's really hard to even figure out which book you're trying to grab next. So yeah, use heading levels. So heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and make sure you're using them consistently. So like, for instance, in a box set, the book title for each book should probably be level 1, right? You know, book 1, book 2, book 3. And then maybe your chapter titles are heading levels 2. So chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And if, say, there's maybe subsections, heading 3, like, and you can go all the way down to 6, though that's probably for an incredibly complex book if you're going all the way down to like heading level 6. The other thing to consider is, and this is more on the like techie, like when you're building your EPUB side, splitting them out into individual files, like HTML files. So I've seen this weird thing sometimes where some tools will take your entire book and put it into one HTML file. For a short book, that's totally fine. Bigger books, it's pretty nightmarish. It can cause a lot of issues with rendering. It can cause a lot of issues with loading, because you know our software is going to try and load the entire file at the same time. And if it contains 5 books inside of it, it's going to be really, really hard to render. So yeah, think about either when you're building the book or when you're maybe talking to someone who's doing this for you, like make sure that the book is kind of chunked out properly. I mean, if you're working with someone who does this professionally, they probably know that already. But if you're trying to do it yourself, like, yeah, be mindful of your file lengths.
That's fair. Kim says that this is really helpful. And as she's looking at her book files in Vellum, they can see all of the areas where detailed descriptions can be added. So that's good to know. And then Joseph is asking, does Kobo do anything to highlight EPUBs that comply with specific accessibility standards? Do we make it more discoverable? I know on Kobo Writing Life that we do general EPUB check. I don't believe we do accessibility check yet, but this is what Wendy is here to work with us on. But you can provide more context.
Yeah, so that is something we're working on. So probably you'll see in like the next 18 months or so, we will be introducing, we will be adding checking. So there is a tool out there called ACE, the Accessibility Checker for EPUB. So we'll be adding that because it's an additional check on top of the validation stuff that we already do. We are also going to be adding accessibility metadata to the author like flow and to the website. So we'll be able to say like, this book is accessible, and not only this book is accessible, but also any features or considerations or even hazards that a book might have within it, so that people can make the best, like most informed decisions about what book to buy next. We also plan to include, I think at the very least, whether a book is accessible or not in things like search, so that you could filter your search down by, oh, this book is going to work for me. I don't have to worry about it. In terms of like lifting these books up, probably as well. Like, I think that's merchandising is probably definitely a consideration we'll want to make in the future, especially as we have more books with this information. One of the reasons I'm kind of reluctant to say like, yeah, we would put them to the top of the list right away is that, people are just building up this knowledge and this practice. So not every author, not every publisher is going to include this data, and it's not going to necessarily mean that the book is not accessible. And I don't want to say like, this book's not accessible because we have no accessibility metadata, when maybe it's absolutely fine, if not good. We just don't have that information yet about the book. So Yes, we were going to add the data soon. If you want to include it with your book, we want it, please provide it when it's available to be provided. But will there be like bonuses? Maybe not right away, but maybe as more and more books have it, we can start leveraging it a little bit more.
I'd love to see the store if you had complete say over how it was created. I think that would be wicked.
We can think of that as like the goal. We're like, eventually we'll be able to merchandise those books specifically. That would be great.
You talked a little bit about images there in general, but is there any difference with a cover image for the alt text? Like, should you include details about like the cover or the sort of title and author and things like that?
Yeah, so I would say in your book, definitely describe your cover, especially if you've put like a lot of time and effort and it's beautiful. Like, it's beautiful, and people do judge a book by its cover, but also like there's some beautiful covers out there, and I think everyone deserves to be able to enjoy them, and alt text allows people to do that. On the store itself, it is something we're looking at, because right now what we do is that we just apply alternative text, alt text, to all of our book covers that tell you what the title of the book is, what it's for, what format it is, and who the author is. So we'll say like, I'm reading Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, or you just finished Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, so I'll just use that, like Yellowface ebook by R.F. Kuang. So okay, this is the title, this is the author. We would love to actually have more detailed descriptions of covers, and we've been asked by users in testing, I would love to know what the cover for this book looks like. We just don't have that information right now, and we absolutely could not at scale provide it, especially because AI tools would probably just be like, this cover is yellow and has text on it. So if publishers or authors are willing to provide it, we probably would start rolling it out on like more of the site. But definitely inside your book, describe your cover, especially if it's like really awesome, and deserves description.
Is there anything authors should avoid doing with maybe like their cover, like avoid certain fonts to make it more accessible, or anything they should keep in mind when creating the cover itself?
So in terms of covers, I would say focus on make them readable, which sounds very vague, but I have seen covers that are like, you have to get really like close, like have it in your hands to actually be able to understand like what's going on the cover. So, and especially you can go to our website, you can go to any book website. Covers are not really big on websites. And so, you might want to actually test your cover image small before you approve it, because you is it still readable at like thumbnail size? Using high contrast colors. So, and I don't mean highlighter yellow on a black background or things like that, but colors that are not, that have enough contrast. And there's ways to measure that, which I have in the links as well. Ways to measure that. There's also like graphic design things you can do to make text stand out over top of a background. Use those tricks. Use really big fonts. Use clean and clear fonts. So you can still use pretty fonts, but don't use like overly convoluted cursive fonts to, put your title on the book. And, just be mindful of like how busy an image is, or if the background is like really, really, really busy, you're going to want to make the text stand out a little bit more. Also, I will say too, because I get complaints from my parents all the time about this, try testing your cover in grayscale, because some covers look fantastic in color and then they get put on an e-reader and it's really hard to see them anymore.
That's a great point.
Yeah. My father loves sending me screenshots of his e-reader. He's like, look at this cover. It's not very readable. Do something about it. And I'm like, I can't. I don't know what you want me to do.
That's such a parent question, like thinking we have full control over everything the publisher is doing.
If I could tell the publishers to fix their covers, I would, Dad, but
You're in charge, Wendy. You fix it. That's so funny.
Yeah.
You should just be like, just try turning it off and on again.
Maybe it'll load better next time.
So can you let's switch up a little bit to talk about audiobooks, because I think there might be like a perception in, again, like this format is an accessible format, but is there anything that authors should consider in terms of accessibility with audiobooks in particular?
Yeah, this is like, I think, an underexplored area of accessibility. One, because audiobooks have always, like, the reason audiobooks were created were to be an accessible format. Like, they were developed in the 20s and 30s for soldiers coming back from World War I who had lost their vision, and this was, conceived of as a way for them to continue being able to read and enjoy content. And then, of course, it was kind of like co-opted into the mainstream. Actually, there's a really interesting book about the history. It's like was it The History of the Talking Book or something like that? Really good book. But it started as an accessibility format, got co-opted by the mainstream, and I think lost some of that until kind of nowadays. But audiobooks are incredibly accessible just as they are. But there's ways to do it better. I think the two things that I would say are like essential and like would like immediately make audiobooks way better. If you've got images in your book, describe them in audio, especially if they're important. Like if they're just decorative, you can skip them. But if you have images in the book that help, make the content better or make the content more understandable, describe them in the audiobook. Like actually include descriptions of of those images in your book when you're doing the narration. The other thing, the structure, like I feel like I bang on about structure a lot, but I hate opening an audiobook where I open the table of contents and it just says track 1, track 2, track 3, track 4, track 5, because it makes the book harder to use. I have I'm a huge audiobook listener. I love audiobooks. It's so much better when I know, oh, I'm on chapter 6 instead of I'm on track 7, and I think halfway through it said chapter 11. Like, it's not a great experience, especially if you're like talking to someone about reading the book and they're like, oh, like, how far are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm 37%. I don't know where I am in the book right now. So yeah, use your table of contents to create informative structure to your book.
That's
if you can get
common.
Audio people to chunk it into chapters, do that.
Yeah, it's like so common that it will just be like a track, or like even worse, like the file name or something when it's like in an audiobook, and it's so hard to navigate. If you're publishing the audiobooks through KWL, it's really, really easy to just enter the name, and the order of the files that you upload is actually creates the table of content. So we try and make that as kind of easy to add those details, and you can add the chapter names, even adding more than just chapter 1 or something,
Yeah, like if you've got chapter names in your book, put them in the audiobook, please. If you do that, and like I love the KWL interface for uploading audiobooks, because it does, like, it's so easy to actually provide that information. You will be way ahead of mainstream publishers. Like I'm currently listening to an audiobook from Hachette, and it is track 1, track 2, track 3, track 4. And this book came out 2 months ago. This isn't like an old book that is, behind the times. Like this just got published and it still has this problem.
That's absolutely wild to me. And like I know that some of them that were like CDs or books on tape will also sometimes just like mid chapter be a new file or something. You like that's it seems such a little thing, but very commonly overlooked.
Yeah, it's either like track 1, track 2, track 3, or it's like ebook version 3 or something that they haven't changed in the ebook file. There's lots of little things like that.
Yeah. So Richard had a question earlier, and I wanted to ask you about it as well. So what can I know that we're working on adding like more accessibility specific metadata, but what can authors do now in terms of their metadata to try and just kind of improve the accessibility of how their book would be on the store?
That's a really good question. I would say you could include it in your summary or your description. Say, this book has been optimized for accessibility. Unfortunately, other than that, there's not any other metadata fields that really strongly call out the accessibility of a book, at least not any that I can think of. I think the summary is probably, at least for now, the best place to do that. Because then if someone's looking at the book, like, oh, hey, this is, I mean, you'll see this actually with other books. Like I see pretty often the summary will include this book does not contain DRM or things like that as well. So that's probably the best way to do it for now. Actually, I guess on a little side note about DRM, DRM is not very accessible. It makes it really hard for users, especially if they have a reading tool that really works for them. A lot of users, especially with print disabilities, will will download the EPUB file or the book from the platforms that they use and load it into the apps or services that work best for them. And DRM makes that really difficult. So I personally recommend, if you can turn DRM off, do it. It's really just a barrier to people with print disabilities. And these people are not looking to pirate your books. They really aren't. They really just want to read the book. And this is a good way to, there are I guess I'll add another thing that we are looking at doing is there are more accessible DRM formats out there, and we are looking at implementing those as part of our accessibility work in the next little while. But in the meantime, or even after that, DRM is not great for accessibility.
I had one last question as we're talking about the format of books and going back to eBooks. Is there anything that authors should be aware about when including external links?
Yes. So when you are marking up your links, you can, it's not necessarily in the markup of the link, but if you are including a link that takes you outside of the book, I would recommend putting some sort of note. You can even put it in say the link text itself to say this goes to my website or this goes to an external source. I definitely recommend not using link text that says very vague things click here or go to this page but not say which page, visit my newsletter. Some of these things are just they're not specific enough. It can be one of the ways that people actually who use screen readers and things navigate sometimes is actually by links. And so if they just see a list of links and it just says click here, click here, click here, click here, it's very confusing. It's click here what? What am I clicking on? So being really, especially if you are including things like external links, be informative with your link and do tell the user if it's going to take them outside of the book, because obviously there are links that will take you within the book as well. And you want to be really conscientious about letting them know what's going to happen.
That's a good reminder, I think, for anyone who uses social media, because I know I'm guilty of the click here. So I need to keep that in mind too when making our Kobo Writing Life social posts.
It's really hard to get. It's a really common convention, and it's really hard to break the habit because it is so common.
Yeah. So that's good to know. And speaking of, I guess, social media and marketing, are there any tips you have for authors when they're creating their websites and how they can make their websites more accessible?
Yeah, lots of things. So a lot of the stuff I kind of already mentioned, around describing your images and, good structure applies to your website as well. In fact, it's the same code in EPUB as it is on your website, HTML. There are a lot of tools out there that can help you build better sites and assess the accessibility of your sites. And so I put together some links to share with you. If you are using site building platforms, so things like Wix or Squarespace, I know Wix for sure has accessibility tooling, and I think Squarespace does as well. Most of them should. It might be something you have to install, but a lot of them now more and more have them kind of built in and native to the platform. So check those out if you're using a platform like that. There's also things that you can do yourself or with the help, like if you're working with like a designer or a developer to build your website, there's some things that you can like ask about or do. The big one is like your color palette. Using a color palette that has really good contrast. So like text is clear to read, but it's not harsh. Like again, like that highlighter yellow on black example, like that's not, for some people that will be great, but they have tools to make that happen. You don't have to do it for them. But making sure the text is really readable, and the colors that you're using are kind of, go well together and create good contrast. A big thing for me, and something I see on a lot of websites, is try to avoid putting text on top of images, with the exception of book covers. It just makes text really, really hard to read. Avoid, and like in addition to that, avoid using images that contain text. So like if you have like a banner for a sale or something, don't just make it like a flat image, like put that text in what we call live text, like actually have it available to the user. I also highly recommend using really clean and easy to read fonts on your site. It can be really tempting to use really like stylized fancy fonts. And some of them look really cool, but they're really hard to read, especially for people with dyslexia or visual processing disorders. So, and like the best options are like, I actually looked up like what are the most ranked as most readable fonts, and surprise, surprise, it's like the most common fonts that people use. So things like Times New Roman, Verdana, Arial, Helvetica. These are all highly recommended fonts. Georgia, Calibri. I think Microsoft literally just announced they have a new font, and I think it is just as readable as Calibri. So, look into that. And then of course, like, as I said, alternative text for your images. Feel free to describe book covers, things like that. And yeah, like use tools. There's a lot of tools out there that you can use to assess your site as well. And that can give you a good idea of like what to do or what to fix on your site.
That's so interesting that authors should really consider that as part of their branding, because like, we often talk about like everything has to be cohesive, like your branding, your website should sort of tell the story of your brand. And yeah, this is just another thing to keep in mind, that like, is your branding something that is accessible, and like, is there areas where you can kind of change or improve things? So that's very interesting. And as part of that as well, another sort of essential marketing tool for authors is their newsletter. So many of them like are through, they are all through like third-party programs. But is there anything in terms of like emails and newsletters that the author should keep in mind, or is it the same sort of practice of describing images and things like that?
It's pretty much the exact same practice. Like I when I wrote notes for this session and on the topics, I was like, same. Like it's a lot like the rules. Once you get the rules down, the rules are the same. Like, describe your images, use good contrast, use really readable fonts and colors, use structure to your advantage. Same thing about the link text thing. Like instead of saying click here, it could be like click here for more information about next book in series. Just being like, these are really basic and easy things to do, but they are also easy to forget. And so it's really important to, just once you get into the practice of it, it'll become pretty second nature. And it also, like, I think one thing when you start applying these principles to your website, your newsletter, social media, like you'll notice that things get better, right? Like you're like, oh, like it's so much easier to read, or this is so much easier to process, or like it looks a lot cleaner. Like a lot of something I've discovered over the years working with our UX team is that a lot of like design fundamentals, like design fundamental principles, cross over incredibly well with accessibility fundamental principles, because it's like a lot of ideas about like how you place content, how you space things, where you put things in proximity to each other. If you do all those really well, you often create a very accessible, easy to use interface. So the more accessible it is, the more usable it is, the happier everyone is.
Nice. And I like the idea of that. Like once you get into the practice of doing it, it should eventually become second nature. Like none of this is anything that's hard or difficult or adding another layer of anything. So I think that's really good advice. And what I like as well with working with our developers and the team that are building out KWL, really keep accessibility front of mind, especially as like we have that new dashboard now that has been rolled out, and I think everything was like audited to make sure it's sort of is as accessible as we can. I think it's one of the reasons why our new map has gray on the images, because it was better with the screen reader to show the dots rather than our old one had red and things like that to keep in mind. So yeah, it's a really interesting, I won't call it a rabbit hole, but it's an interesting world to dip into that I should be thinking about more.
It's one of those things, like, you know, when someone like it's in your house and they point out like a picture is crooked and then you can't stop seeing that your picture is crooked. Once you start, I joke that like once I started doing accessibility work, like I can't stop noticing when things are really good and when things are really bad.
I mean, that's why you're doing such a great job, and like the passion that you bring to this is sort of like it's so contagious. So I always admire like the work that you're doing. I think it's really great, especially to have somebody like you within Kobo that we can default all of our questions to. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and who can help us make sure that the dashboard is accessible for authors and help us with that work and checking everything there. So yeah, it's very helpful. As Tara said, we're definitely guilty of not thinking about some of these things ourselves. And one of the ones that I would like to be more conscious about is social media. What are some things that we might not realize are making our posts like less accessible for users? Because I know emojis is one of those things.
So social media is like a really interesting thing because obviously there's different platforms, there's different formats. So I think like there's a couple of different things to think about. Like one of them is, again, alternative text. I think most of the main social media platforms now, so like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon for the like 10 people and me who are using it, all have ways to add alternative text directly to the image. You can often find this through the options or the edit menu when you add an image to a post. So that's really useful. I highly recommend it. If the platform doesn't have it for some reason, or it's, you know, maybe not working, I don't know, you can use the caption. And I've actually seen this really interestingly on TikTok. I've seen a lot of TikTokers use their captions as a way to provide an image or a video description, especially when they can't, because like for things like videos, it's actually hard to provide video description on most of the main platforms today. And so the caption is a good way to do that. Again, you want to keep it succinct and you want to keep it short, but especially if it's like, you know, a video where you're pointing at an image, you might want to describe that in the caption. Another thing to consider is for video content, so like Reels, TikToks, YouTube videos, applying captions. So turning on that feature when you're putting together that post. I believe at this point, almost all the platforms have the option to generate captions for your content. If it's possible, I highly recommend reviewing the captions before you post, because I have seen some absolutely hilarious transcription errors over the years of automated captions. I also recommend, so this is less so on TikTok than on Instagram, but I have noticed that there's a couple different formats for captions. And the one on Instagram that I want to call out is that one that has like multiple sizes of fonts, where it's like one word will be really big and then the next word will be smaller. And then they kind of like slide in and out of view. They look cool. They are not good for accessibility. They're really hard to track for people. So I recommend using like the, you know, like it's not exciting, but the standard just at the bottom of the screen, gray background, white text. Use that, please. It's the best option. If you're gonna provide the captions yourself, like there are tools out there to do it. Because one funny thing now that I started to see is I kind of wish Instagram and TikTok would build a feature where they could detect that you've provided captions, because I'm now starting to get the like double captions experience on a lot of posts. But I'd rather have double captions than no captions at all, so I won't complain. but yeah, making sure they're really easy to read. Try and transcribe them really well. There are, I believe on YouTube, you are able to provide things like audio description for videos. So there's this way that you can actually provide a secondary track where someone will, like, where you can add a audio description of what is happening in the video. That is something to consider. There is, I can probably dig up the link for it in the list, but there's an Apple ad that came out last year that uses audio description in a really interesting way. And it's a really good example of like, actually, like you've probably not heard it, but you've probably seen it if you've ever watched television and they tell you that the TV show is available in described video. That's what an audio description is. And it's really useful for people who are low vision or blind to be able to know what is going on in the video. So you can do that, I think, only on YouTube, though, and not on other platforms, unfortunately.
Can you talk about emojis as Laura mentioned it there? Because I know
yes,
sometimes
emojis.
with, especially with email subjects, I am guilty
Yes.
sometimes of adding emojis to ours. I try not to, but can you tell us why we shouldn't?
So someone could probably write a book about emojis. It's not that you shouldn't, it's that you should use them carefully, is maybe the best way to describe the use of emojis. Emojis can be really, really useful for some people in terms of conveying meaning or making something a little bit easier to like understand. A good example is actually like people with dyslexia. They can often, an image, I can like kind of process that a little bit better than text. So I don't say don't use emojis. I do say use emojis carefully. So every emoji, if you've inputted it properly, does have a name, and it is communicated to assistive technologies like screen readers. Sometimes those names are painfully long, especially if you're using emojis that have the color variation. So like if you have the thumbs up emoji, it'll be like skin tone 3 thumbs up emoji. And if you've got 3 of those in your post, it's going to say skin tone 3, and it's going to keep repeating, and it's not very fun. Actually, a really popular example of like, don't use emojis like this because it's really unpleasant is there was a meme for a while on like TikTok and things where people would put the clapping emoji between each word. So it'd be like, stop, breaking the spines of your books. Well, if you were someone using a screen reader, your experience of that post would be skin tone 3 clapping emoji, stop, skin tone 3 clapping emoji, like, and you skip that post. You're like, I don't care. This could have been important. No, I'm not going through that. So I would say probably don't open with an emoji if you're doing something. If you're using like the image of an emoji, hide it. So like there's a way to like, you can say something is decorative or like hidden from view, which means like someone using a screen reader won't see it, but someone who is like reading the newsletter will be able to see it. Put them at the end of the sentence or use them really sparingly and only when they actually enhance meaning as opposed to take away from it. And there are, I'm trying to remember which website it is. I might be able to dig it up. There is a way also to figure out what an emoji would be read out as. So then you can decide whether it's like really, really going to be annoying, like skin tone 3 clapping hands emoji, or is it going to be like leaves? And and then it's it's not so bad because it's not going to be super disruptive.
My favorite one is slight smiling face, because it's just it's not very happy when you read it like that, and people use it as it's like slight smile. I love that.
Yeah, there's and also, yeah, like that's the thing is like I think the visual meaning of a lot of emojis and the like name for the emoji don't always track, so you lose some meaning there.
And I think they evolve so fast, like how people are using emojis and interpreting them precisely.
Yeah. This isn't a post about cooking.
Thank you for all of that. I think what we've learned through this talk is there's a lot of things we could all be doing differently or like learning a bit more about. So I feel like it's been successful. We've taken up a lot of your time, but I just want to end with one more question, and then we'll add your list of links into the comments so everyone can see all the resources as well. what do you think the publishing industry as a whole needs to improve on to create more accessible content? I know it's a bit of a hard question. I'm sure there's a few things you could add to the list.
I will say the publishing industry in several countries, Canada included, has already made huge strides in making content more accessible. It is delightful to know about and see. The biggest barriers, honestly, have been funding, having the money, especially when we talk about things like the backlist. Some publishers have really, really big backlists, and it can be a challenge to have to go back to all of those books and remediate them to make them accessible, especially if the book hasn't been out for like 10 years. That's a big challenge for them. Some of them are trying to figure out ways to tackle it. Some of them are, we'll see what happens. Hilariously, alt text is a big one, especially when we go back to older books where it's like, okay, well, like, who should be responsible for alt text? Should authors provide the alt text for the images? Should the production person do the alt text for images? Should the editor do it? A lot of publishers are trying to figure that out right now. And then it's just kind of the other stuff. It's like, especially if they're for publishers that produce maybe more complex content, so like textbook publishers or educational publishers, how do we make content accessible that's like kind of complex? So like if books have a lot of images or books have a lot of like visualizations or graphs or things like that, like how do we get that content out as accessibly as possible for our audience? So there's a lot of things going on in the publishing industry. There's a lot of good resources out there, though. There's a lot of people that are like, I put some of them in the list because a lot of people have been doing this work for a long time. But yeah, like it's we're all in this together. Everyone's trying to figure this out, and it will get better. And it is getting better already.
Well, that's a nice note to end on. And thanks, Wendy, for coming and chatting with us. It's I think we could keep talking about this all the time. And like I said, I love the passion that you bring to this, and it really just puts accessibility on the forefront of people's minds. I know for us at Kobo for sure. And thanks so much for the engaged chat. We had a lot of good comments there, and I hope that people found something helpful from it. We're going to add Wendy's stuff to the chat and then also to the blog post that was linked there. So, and I think the accessibility email for Wendy was also shared in the comments. So if you have any specific questions, if that's okay, Wendy,
yes,
they can email you with that as well.
Yes, if anyone has specific questions, absolutely happy to field queries to the email. So.
Nice. Well, thanks so much. And yeah, we really appreciate your time. And thanks for co-hosting with me, Laura. And we'll see you all again. Actually, we're taking a break next month, but we'll be back again with a live chat in October. So yeah, it'll be nice and spooky.
Very exciting.
Thanks,
thank you for having me.
And thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Have a great rest of the day.